Good evening, everyone, those of us who are here. And
Good
welcome.
evening.
Thank you. Thank you. And this evening's Chop It Up features the Honorable Senator, former Lieutenant Colonel, now retired Air Force, Ben Clark. We are so honored to have you with us, Senator Clark. Why don't you greet the folks and tell them hello and tell us a little bit about yourself today.
Thank you, Dr. McAllister. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and the folks out there in the audience. Again, I am Ben Clark. I'm a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, retired state senator. I served the counties of Hoke and Cumberland for 10 years in the North Carolina Senate. Currently, I am a 20-year information technology professional working in the private sector as a defense contractor at Fort Liberty, formerly known as Fort Bragg, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. But more importantly now, I am seeking to become the next Lieutenant Governor of the state of North Carolina, and I would certainly appreciate your support in 2024. Now, of course, I'm sure you all ask out there in the audience, well, why me? Why do I want to be the Lieutenant Governor? And why should you consider supporting me for that particular office? Well, first and foremost, I believe that North Carolina, and you, as North Carolinians, deserve a lieutenant governor who will embrace all North Carolinians without exception and serve them well. Now, I assure you that I will be that kind of lieutenant governor, and I will embrace all North Carolinians. I will serve your interests and make sure that our state works on your behalf and stands by your side. Now, furthermore, I believe that our state has an obligation to provide everyone, regardless of their station in life, a safe and healthy environment in which they have the opportunity and liberty to pursue a thriving and fulfilling quality of life in our state, North Carolina, which happens to be the state that I was born, raised, and educated in, and the state I like calling home. Now, our state has a long history under Democratic rule of leaning forward in its approach to education, healthcare, nurturing the environment, technological advancement, national defense, and we have an obligation and we must maintain that forward-leaning posture for the benefit of all our citizens. And I tell you, that is my cause, that is my focus, that is why I want to serve to move our state forward and not one step back. And furthermore, to extinguish the flames of hatred and bigotry roaring across our state, masquerading as religion and faith, with the main protagonist being the current occupant of the office. So we need to come together and step forward as a community, provide for a thriving community, pursuing the common good, sustaining excellence in public education, promoting justice and equality, expanding access to healthcare, nurturing our environment, and cultivating a thriving and inclusive economy for all North Carolinians. So I hope you will consider me to serve as your next Lieutenant Governor for the state of North Carolina.
Well, thank you for introducing yourself and for that opening statement, Senator Clark, and we all hold you in high esteem, and we're grateful for your prior service and for what you bring to the office of Lieutenant Governor should you be the victor in 2024. I do have a series of questions that I'm going to ask you, and these pertain to your life experiences and many things that you have experienced throughout your professional career, which is a long and distinguished career of service. And so we want you to respond to these questions, not only for those who are here tonight, but for all of those who will listen to this webinar in the future. We are recording it, and we are hopeful that as persons view your responses and listen to what you have to say, not only here, but also as you travel around the state of North Carolina, that it will help to galvanize support and momentum for your campaign, and certainly inspire men of color. For those who do not know, this Chop It Up conversation is principally about the plight, the circumstances, the needs, the interests and concerns of all men of color who live in the state of North Carolina. That covers more than African Americans. That also includes Hispanics and Latinx and Asian Pacific Islanders, anyone who would consider themselves to be an ally, really, of men of color, because so often men of color would not only shy away from politics, but restrain their wisdom and insights for barbershop conversations. So what we're doing tonight is really having a kind of barbershop conversation. Now, what I think I would like to do, I'm getting a text that says, Dr. McAllister, if you share the link to the recording, we'll share it on the Facebook pages and different pages. And so we'll get to that. I'm going to ask Sophie and Shantae if they would post any links that need to be posted in the chat so persons have access to all of that. Senator Clark, let me ask you something about your background to start this conversation off.
All righty.
You are a native North Carolinian, is that right?
That is correct.
How would you describe your growing up experiences here in the state?
Okay, let me talk to you about that, Dr. McAllister. First of all, I was even born in North Carolina for sure. As a matter of fact, at Fort Liberty Army Hospital. But my first recollections of life, that is, are in a trailer in Spring Lake, which is just north of Fort Bragg. And I recall living there for a couple of years, and then we moved into Fayetteville in a neighborhood called Hollywood Heights. And at the time, it was a brand new neighborhood. Now, it was an African-American neighborhood, and the streets were freshly paved. All the houses were new. It had that new smell to them. So it was a new adventure for me, moving out of the trailer and into an actual housing area. Now, on my street, one thing that became quickly apparent is that to us as kids, that most of the folks there, their fathers were members of the Army. And as was my father. As a matter of fact, he ultimately became a helicopter pilot and flew a mission over there in Vietnam. Now, as you might imagine, having a Army soldier as a father, came from a disciplined home, to say the least. I mean, when my father spoke, we listened, and when he directed, we responded appropriately and accordingly. And after my father retired from the Army, he decided to become a pastor and founded his own church, St. Jude Missionary Baptist Church. So not only did we have a disciplined home with a lot of structure, we had a praying home and a God-believing home, and church was a regular part of our lives every Sunday, if not at least once, if not two times. And so that was sort of like the home life, if you will. And the neighborhood, it was pretty much not just my street was like that, but many of the streets in the neighborhood were like that, where you had the fathers were members of the military and Army. So we were somewhat steeped in the military tradition, as you will. And so that was sort of my life coming up. And my father and mother were committed to our educations, and they were committed to us, making sure that we did what we were supposed to do in school. And not only were they committed by making sure that we did what we were supposed to do in the public school system, they were also dedicated savers, because they wanted to make sure that they had the funds to send my siblings and I, there were three of us, myself and my brother and sister, each of us to college, and they did exactly that. So they made sure that all of us went to college, got a college degree, and were able to pursue the careers of our dreams.
So you talk about your going to school, and I believe you went to North Carolina A&T, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. As a matter of fact, when I was in high school, one of the things I did was I participated in the ROTC program at the high school. So that gave me the notion that, hey, well, I think I want to do ROTC when I go to college and ultimately become a pilot. So off I went to A&T State University, and one of the first things I did was enroll in the ROTC program, the Air Force ROTC program. and also I enrolled to become or to matriculate in the career of electrical engineering. But it took me only one semester to realize that I was woefully unprepared to pursue a degree in electrical engineering. Like when I was in high school, the highest math I had taken was Algebra 2, and I did that in my junior year, so I spent my whole senior year not taking any math whatsoever. So I arrived at A&T State University. I've enrolled in this engineering program, and the first thing I have to do is sit down and take an engineering calculus course, and you can imagine what that might be like, not having seen any math at all for a year. So clearly I was in over my head, but like I say, my mission was the commission. That was the main thing I wanted to do, was become an Air Force pilot. So I changed majors very quickly, found something that was suitable for my level of intellect at the time, that is, that I could finish in 4 years, and ultimately pursue my career as an Air Force officer. Now, I stated I wanted to be a pilot, but because at the time, you had to take a battery of about 5 eye tests, and I passed 4 of the eye tests, and 1 I did not pass, and therefore I was not qualified to become a pilot. And I suspect nowadays they probably don't even have those tests anymore. But so ultimately I ended up going into the field. At the time we called it communications and computers, but now we just call it information technology. And now while I was in the RTC program, that really did benefit me in terms of my matriculation at the university, as well as set me up for a successful career in the Air Force. And you say, well, why might that be? Well, I'll get to a little bit of it later, but I'll talk to you about some of it now, because in that program, there were 2 things that you had to focus on. You had to focus on your academics, of course, but the other thing you had to focus on was leadership. The purpose of the Air Force RTC program at the university level is to build leaders for the United States Air Force. And if in the Army RTC program, it's the same thing, just for the Army. So you participate in leadership academics, and you participate in leadership practices through drill and ceremony and things of that sort, and going to field training camp during the summers. So you're constantly being exposed to leadership theory and leadership practice and leadership in the academic realm. And that did a lot for me when I actually went into the Air Force, and as well as my careers outside of the Air Force and beyond.
Well, I can relate to some of that. I did not spend a full 20 years, but as a commissioned officer in the United States Army, having gone through an RTC program, Senator Clark, I can definitely relate to the fact that leadership development, especially, I would say, at an HBCU, is something that is uniquely preparatory for public service. And so, but I did not realize that you actually became a pilot. Tell us about your career as a pilot.
Well, actually, I may not have been clear. I wanted to become a pilot, but I did
Okay.
not become a pilot because of my situation with my eyes.
Okay, that's right. You did say that.
So I did end up going into information technology. Now, when you first go on active duty as a newly minted second lieutenant, the first thing you have to do is you have to go to what we call our specialty school. Now, when I was in the RTC program back at A&T, they used to warn us, now, when you go to those tech schools, you better make sure that you're on top of everything, because if you flunk out of that school, that's the end of your career. So you can imagine I was feeling a little tense when I arrived there. Not that they hadn't prepared me, but this notion that, hey, if I don't do well here, my career is over before it even got started. So I tell you, when I arrived at Keystone Air Force Base, and once I got over the fact of how beautiful it was, seeing the palm trees, driving up and down the street, going to the Oak Club and saying like, wow, wow. I said, okay, let me get down to the brass tacks here and make sure I perform well in this academic course, which was lasted about 6 months, I believe. And I got into it, and I realized very quickly that, hey, I can do this, and it's not overtaxing me. So one thing I decided to do is I decided to enroll in our squadron officer school by correspondence, while at the same time doing my communications and computers course. Because at the time you could do that, and that was before the computer era. So essentially they'd send you a series of books, and then you would read the sections you were supposed to read. You send your envelope off, and they would send you an exam. You take that, send it in, and you go through this process. So what I decided to do is I received my books and immediately sent off for the exam. So then I would spend my evenings after classes doing the communications and computer studies. studying the squadron officer school material. While my friends were out having a good time, I was studying part two. So to make the long story short, by the time I've graduated from the school and received my acknowledgement as a professional in computers and communications and computers, I'd also finished squadron officer school. So when I arrived at my first duty assignment, which was at Fellberg Air Force Station in Germany, one of the first things the officer I was replacing told me to do is he said, you need to start working on your squadron officer school. You need to get that under your belt. And I said, I've already done it. And he looked at me like, of course, you couldn't have done it. He said, how did you do that? I said, I did it while I was at comm school. But nevertheless, they were pretty impressed by the initiative that I took there. And now, when I arrived at Fellberg Air Force Station in Germany, I'll tell you about how A&T prepared me in that RTC program. That was the only time when I was at RTC program, I'd risen to the level of Cadet Corps Commander, which meant I was top cadet in the unit there. That was the only time in my life that I'd actually been in charge of anything. So, and at that time, our Cadet Corps had a student body of about 300 cadets. So I was in charge of the training and operations for 300 cadets in the first semester of my senior year. I had arrived at Fellberg Air Force Station, and then I had only been there 4 months. The commander was relieved of duty. There were only 2 officers at that site of 100 people, which meant I had assumed command of that facility. So I was in charge for the next 4 months. And like I said, prior to that, my only experience ever being in charge of anything was as a cadet in the Air Force ROTC detachment at A&T State University. So that was a significant moment in my Air Force career, being able to get through that and do so successfully. And essentially it set the stage for a successful Air Force career for the remainder of my time in the Air Force. I didn't mean to get drug out. I wanted to talk about some of my other assignments. So if I need to quit, I'll just go ahead. Otherwise, I'll continue on and tell you a little bit more.
Well, let me back up, sort of roll back the tape. You mentioned O Club, and for those who don't know what O Club means, that means Officers Club.
Oh yeah, sorry about it.
That's not one of those other clubs, that sometimes military, especially enlisted servicemen might go to for fun. He's talking about the O Club, which is a place for fun, by the way.
Yeah, but think of it as a fine dining place for officers, because that's pretty much why I was going there. And pretty much all I'd seen was maybe the inside of a McDonald's or Burger King. And all of a sudden I step into this place and see this fancy dining facility and with fancy menus and options that you could choose from. And I'm like, my goodness, boy, I really made it. So that was my thought process there.
Well, if you want to tell us a little bit more about your career as an officer, sure, go ahead and do that.
Okay, so and then I left Fellberg and I went to Scott Air Force Base, which is located in Illinois there. Now, I had a great assignment overall, but I want to tell you a little bit about this particular assignment because this is where I did hit a road bump of sorts, although overall the assignment was a pretty good one. But when I arrived there, I happened to be working for a gentleman, and I can remember I was working on this particular project. Essentially, it was to develop a new engineering plan, or should I say revise, yes, an existing engineering plan. Mm-hmm. Now, this engineering plan had originally been developed by somebody that worked for the gentleman who was my boss, and he was considered one of the top engineers at the site. And not only had this guy done it, the project had also been signed off by my now boss. So he said, Ben, I want you to revise this. Essentially, all I had to do was modify the parts list, which I did. So I turned it back into him, and it came back to me bleeding red. You'd have thought I bled all over the document. And I looked at that, and I was puzzled by this. I'm like, wait a minute, you had already approved this document. Your signature is on it. The top engineer in the facility was the one who had done the project, and all I did was change parts list. I didn't make any other changes to the document. Why is all of this red on it all of a sudden? So I could have complained, hey, maybe I'm being discriminated against, racial discrimination or something like that. But I said, I just bit my lip and said, okay, I'll fix it. So I took the document back and went and corrected all of the things that he had marked red that he had already approved before, and fixed it up and sent it back to him. And I often thought that had that been my first assignment in the Air Force, that probably would have been the end of my career, because I could not see that I would have gone on after an experience like that. But that was not my first assignment. My first assignment had gone very well, and I was very well appreciated. So fortunately, at that particular location, I was moved to another branch about 6 months down the road anyway, and it was like night and day.
Mhm.
And so then when I left Scott, I went back to Germany, Capone Air Station, which was not too far from Rhein-Main Air Base area, which is, for those who are not familiar with the bases in Germany, I'll just say it was not too far away from Frankfurt, which was the capital of Germany.
Yes.
And so that assignment turned out to be pretty good because I happened to work at a small location, small unit. And it was a headquarters unit, but it was small. And there were about 10 or so captains that were in the field of communications and computers. And then eventually one of them was appointed to serve as a branch chief for a group of about 6 people. And I was one selected to do that. Now, why they chose me above all the other captains, I don't, to this day, I don't know, but I was chosen. So I was the only one who actually had the opportunity to run a branch while we were there at that European Common Division assignment. So then I left there and I went to Ramstein Air Base and I worked for what we call the Allied Air Force of Central Europe, which was a NATO organization. Mm-hmm. And I performed in what we would call an inspector general type role, which means I traveled around with a group of other officers to various bases in Germany, NATO bases. So those were bases from other countries. So we go like to maybe Denmark, Sweden. We were in Germany, maybe Italy. We travel around to many nations that had bases that were NATO bases. And so that was a very enlightening experience and a very rewarding one as well. And also highlighted another aspect of my career at that time. So even at that time, you were beginning to see more African Americans in the officers' corps within the Air Force. In the particular field that I was in, that information technology field, we were still few and far between. So like on that particular team that I'm telling you about, the IG team, there were only 2 of us. I can remember a time when we went to a place in Borfink, which was in Denmark, and we went on the post, and after showing our ID card the first time, after that, they never asked us to show it again, because apparently we were the only blacks on the whole installation. So there was no way that, we could, they knew who we were, to make the long story short.
I see. As I was listening a few moments ago, the word that came to my mind, Senator Clark, with respect to your development, your matriculation, your career, particularly the part that you were just talking about, is how well prepared you are to handle adversity. How do you deal as a politician? You've served in the Senate for 10 years, 2 terms. How well what has prepared you to handle adversity as a leader? And I know that's not one of the questions that I said I was going to ask, but I can't resist the urge to pose that question, because it seems to me that our politics is fraught with so much polarization, division, even hostility, bordering on the point of actually causing some individuals to even throw in the towel. But here you are, having served in the military, having served 2 terms, knowing what racism is, knowing the climate that we're in, knowing how adverse it can be. How do you handle adversity, and what guides you when you face adversity?
Yeah, thank you for that question. A lot of it goes back, I would have to say, ultimately, to the way I was raised in my home with my mother and father. I mean, because they always handled adversity so well. As a matter of fact, in my home, to me, it always felt as though everything was fine. Now, I know that they had their struggles, especially in my adult life. They tell me about the hardships that they had when I was growing up. But it was never apparent to me or my siblings. It just seems like we're living in a wonderland type home. Everything always seemed to work right. There was always food on the table. And my father's ministry, things went well at the church. Maybe there were things going on I didn't know about, but I guess so. You just sort of model yourself after your parents. And then again, I have to go back to A&T. When I had the opportunity to serve as a Cadet Corps Commander, as well as other leadership positions at the campus, but I'll just keep it to the Air Force ROTC thing. You're put in a position where not only when you're at the school itself, but when you go to field training, where you're exposed to situations where you are challenged, and you either have to respond and be successful, or you fail. Now, failing is not a death sentence. You learn from that too. And at the time, I would tell you, I didn't like those exercises because it seems like they were set up to make you fail, but they were set up to challenge you. So after going through a lot of that, and then you actually get into the Air Force, and if you keep your head on your shoulders and you remain calm and you remain confident in your abilities, and you know that you're doing well despite what others might try to make it feel like, you just press on and you do what you can, and you have faith that God's going to make a way, as we will say, and that things ultimately are going to be all right. So you just keep your head down and you keep doing that. And I took the same approach in the Senate. And like I tell my wife sometimes, I say, wherever I've been in the Air Force, and this is more so applies to jobs where you go in and you have a lot of folks working in the unit or in the section you might be in, and sometimes jobs overlap, and sometimes people may prefer to do one thing or another. And I told her, wherever I went, I always had this philosophy: I am going to make myself useful, and I'm going to make my own rice bowl. If somebody else is doing it, I don't want to do it. Let them have it. I want to find what either they're not doing that needs to be done, or what they can't do and needs to be done, or what they don't want to do. And I'm going to do those things, and I'm going to do it well. And when I took that approach, I almost often found success. And I did the same thing in the state Senate. Because I can remember when I first got there, we had the position of caucus secretary, and I was sort of watching the position. I was like, well, what is this person doing? I never saw anything happening. And I said, like, shucks, I mean, if I were in that position, I'd be doing things and make things happen. But ultimately, the person decided to resign the seat because I guess she decided she wanted to go on to do other things, and the seat became vacant. So I just sat and watched a while and to see who was going to get appointed to the position, and nobody did. So I approached Senator Blue, who was the leader at the time, and said, I'd like to be the Senate caucus secretary. And he said it's fine with him. He brought it up to the members and nobody objected, and I became the caucus secretary. And I started immediately putting meat into the position. Like I wrote essentially the guidelines that covered how we would conduct our meetings and our relations with one another. And I also ultimately use that as a platform to take the lead on the redistricting activities that we did in the last bienniums and previous bienniums, and it required a lot of coming up to speed outside of the committees within the General Assembly itself. I had to do a lot of preparation at home, and my wife would tell you that. Spent many evenings, studying up on redistricting maps and learning how to actually generate districting plans myself, so I wouldn't have to rely on anybody else to do them for me on the General Assembly staff. So I would always take that type of approach. And when you do that and you prepare yourself and you accept that things are not always going to go your way, but you just do what you can and you keep your head down and you keep moving, things tend to work out okay.
This is a really compelling conversation, and I want to ask a lot of questions, but I also am getting a few dings on my phone saying, "Hey, let us chime in and ask a few questions of Senator Clark as well." So I'm going to do that in just a moment, but I do want to ask you at least one question while I still have the floor.
No problem.
I want to ask you about specifically your campaign. I know you've been traveling throughout North Carolina, particularly focusing on the western counties.
That's correct.
And you're working your way throughout the entire state of North Carolina. That suggests that you are also not only someone who takes initiative and who is a self-motivated, self-inspired individual and a leader, but you also know how to strategically plan. How do those experiences relate to the role of lieutenant governor in terms of chairing the Senate, but also being strategic as a leader, as a planner, as a thinker?
Okay, first of all, one thing that you have to do, I believe, and I've always done, is sometimes you have to think outside of the box. I cannot follow someone else's path to the objective that I want to achieve, because you always have to design a path that's suitable for you. And before I talk about the going to all 100 counties, let me sort of back up a little bit and talk about how when I first became elected to the state Senate. Now, when I was running for that seat to represent Hoke and Cumberland counties, there were about 6 or 7 people running. It was an open seat. And nobody expected that I would be able to win. Okay, they said, who's this guy? He's not a politician. We've never heard of him. Oh, we know his father, Dr. Clark, but, Ben Clark, who is he? And, but like I said, thinking outside of the box, I'm like, well, I was born and raised in Cumberland County. I know some folks, maybe not the politicians and the politicos, maybe they don't know me, but I know some folks over there know me, as well as in Hoke County where I was living at the time. So I took the post and I said, okay, well, I'm going to do the best that I can. And after that first election, I came in second place by about 2 votes. Actually, it was 3 initially. Then they did a recount, and then it was down to 2. So I made it to second place by 2 votes. Okay, so and then at that point, everybody certainly expected me to lose the runoff because I was running against Billy King, who had been a 20-year county commissioner in Cumberland County. And everybody knew him, and they said, there's no way Clark's going to be able to win that. So I think he felt that way too and went on vacation, and I hit the street. I was determined, although I couldn't hit every house, I was going to knock on the door of as many houses as I could. I got beat up by the sun. I remember going up to one house dripping in sweat, probably looking as dark as coal from having been out in the sun all day. And the lady looked at me, "You need some water, sir?" And I said, "Sure, thank you." But to make that long story short, when I was at the poll, I can remember somebody going by and said, "We're going to vote for you. I remember when you came to my house." And I heard that so many times. And so that became one of the things for me. I know I can't go to every single house in the state of North Carolina, but I'm going to go see a person in every single county that votes and that's going to vote in that election, in every single county. And I know a lot of times, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing to do, a lot of times when they go to counties, the first thing we Democrats want to do is we want to go to a meeting of the North Carolina Democratic Party office for that county, whether it's Cumberland County or Hoke County or Chatham County, whatever. That's fine. But I tell my wife, like I say, I'm going to see somebody who's not at that meeting. A regular person, and I'm going to have the opportunity to talk to them and see what's on their mind that's not steeped in, either Democratic or Republican tradition or whatever, just regular folks out on the street. I want to talk to them. I want them to see the person who ultimately will serve them in that seat as lieutenant governor. So that being said, we said, well, we want to go to 100 counties and let us start out west. There's a practical reason for that. One being we know the weather's going to get bad in the winter. And so I'm not going to be driving up through the snow, winter storms and all that kind of stuff. So we said, let's hit the west first while the weather's good, and we'll make our way back to the center and through the eastern part of the state. Now, so we pretty much conquered the west, and now we're working in areas in the center and on the coast as well as opportunities come up to try to maximize our exposure to the various counties. And also, I'd like to emphasize that just because I've been to a county once doesn't mean I'm not going back. We've already been back to some multiple times, and we'll continue to do that. But we just have to make sure that people from each county, at least someone or a few folks, have the opportunity to see the person who wants to serve them. Now, I think I mentioned briefly that I also served on the redistricting committee for the North Carolina Senate Democrats. And I played a very significant role in that, as well as our activity in trying to make sure the census was properly conducted within our state. And because of that, as well as my personal experience in IT and understanding of data and databases, I have the ability to essentially parse the data and see where our strengths are likely to be and weaknesses are likely to be in terms of those who might support us in the electorate across the state or across a particular district of interest. And by being able to do that, fortunately, I don't have to pay someone else to do that for me, which can be quite expensive to have someone doing that on your behalf. So, and so using those skills, that background, as well as my wife, who is an exceptional communicator, we form a very formidable team, and we're able to do some good work, we believe.
And this really gives me an opportunity to thank your wife, Dion, who I believe is on this call tonight. And I've been able to have several conversations with her, and I can bear witness. What you have said is absolutely true. Both of you make a dynamic team together, and I'm sure that she would be a wonderful second lady in the state of North Carolina, if there is such a way of describing her, should you win the office of Lieutenant Governor.
Well, she may be a great second lady, but she's a great first lady to me.
All right. Well, that's great to hear. I'm hearing several words come to mind, several descriptors: leader, innovator, one who handles adversity, one who handles adversity enormously well, but also someone who is resilient. Now, these are things that I hear. I want those who are listening to this call, who on the call tonight, if you have a question you want to ask Senator Clark, let's continue this conversation by opening up the floor to some of you. I see Dr. Nathan Click is on the line. And Dr. Click, do you have a question for Senator Clark tonight? I think you're on mute.
There we go. I'm off mute now. Thank you, Reverend McAllister. Senator Clark, first off, Aggie Pride and Go Blackbirds.
Aggie Pride.
That's right. I'm also an alumni of Det 605 and a former cadet commander.
Okay.
Yeah.
What year were you there?
2005 is when I graduated.
All right. Yeah, I came out in 81.
Yep. So, so I can relate to the experiences that that training gives us. So the question I have for you mentioned the current occupant of the lieutenant governor's office, and that individual is running for governor currently.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Can you give us some insight on what the problems and the dangers would be for not only for Democrats but for people of color in North Carolina if an individual like that were to win the office of governor?
Okay. Whew.
I figured I'd start off with an easy one.
Oh yeah, that won't take a long time, but let me put it this way. Let's put it this way. When I first went into the General Assembly in 2013, unfortunately at that time the Republicans had a supermajority in the state Senate, a supermajority in the House. They had the governorship, but fortunately at that time we had the majority of the members on the state Supreme Court, and we did have the majority of the members on the Council of State. Now, what the Republicans are trying to do, there's no doubt in my mind, in 2024, which is why we cannot have a repeat of 2022, is they want to capture the governorship. As a matter of fact, they want to capture all the positions on the Council of State, from the governor, the lieutenant governor, the treasurer, all of them, you name it, Secretary of State, and the auditor. They want to capture all those positions. They want to further extend their control on the state Supreme Court. Currently, they have 5 of the 7 seats. One is up for grabs in the 2024. So can you imagine a situation in which all of a sudden now they have the position of governor, lieutenant governor, supermajorities in the state Senate that are more robust than what they have now, and the same in the House? That will give them the ability to essentially pass any legislation they want. And it's not going to get vetoed by Robertson as the governor if he were to win. And even if he did, the General Assembly would be able to override his vetoes. But he's already made it clear that, hey, just send me the legislation and I'm going to sign it. So the things that we value, sort of like sustaining excellence in education, and in part that means funding it up to the levels required by Leandro. For those who are not familiar with it, essentially the courts stated a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago or so, that the General Assembly needed to provide an additional $500 million to the education bucket for public education in order to comply with the Leandro ruling that would provide a sound basic education for all of our students in the public schools. And was their determination, and it has been actually for 20 years, that the General Assembly is not living up to that constitutional obligation to provide that to our kids. And most of the folks impacted by that lack of appropriate funding for the public schools are the people of color who live especially in the poor communities of the urban areas and the poor communities out in the rural areas. I've often said that when it comes to education in our state, the kids who happen to belong to families who have means, their families are going to be able to provide a good quality education for them. They're either going to move to where the schools are much better, or they're going to put them in private schools that are much better, but they will find a way. Mm-hmm. And also consider the expansion of healthcare. I can remember as being a freshman senator in that 2013 year, when Senator Apodaca stood on the floor. He was the Rules Chair of the State Senate at the time, and waving this little bill in his hand saying that we are not going to expand Medicaid in the state of North Carolina, which we still have not done up to this point. Hopefully it'll get done this year. I believe the Republicans in the House and Senate have finally come to an agreement that they're going to go ahead and pass it out with the budget soon, if they haven't done so today. But we've gone over a decade in which 500,000 folks who could otherwise have had access to healthcare have not had it for a 10-year period, and a large percentage of those folks are African Americans, unfortunately. So, and also if we look at environmental issues, now I understand we have to have a compromise between providing for businesses the ability to operate, and sometimes, our requirements for maintaining a pristine environment, sometimes you have to give a little in order for our economy to move, but not to the extent that they want to. And I can remember one of the things that they did during my freshman year is they passed legislation that said that no municipality or county government in the state of North Carolina can pass legislation that imposes stricter environmental protections than what is already provided by the federal government. And I thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard of. I mean, there may be certain circumstances in a given municipality or county which would make it appropriate for you to do so, but they'd strip the ability to do so from the citizens. And also consider what might happen as they continue with their culture wars. We remember a bill called HB 2, which was dubbed the bathroom bill, but the most insidious thing about that bill was not the bathroom component of it, the part that went unspoken, because that didn't capture the imagination of the citizens, of the media of the state. But one thing that was hidden in that bill was a provision that would exclude the ability to sue for workplace discrimination in our state courts. In other words, you'd have to go to federal courts to sue for workplace discrimination. And as you might imagine, it would be much more difficult to do so, much more expensive, and much more timely, as opposed to being able to sue for such egregious behavior within our own state courts. But fortunately, we were able to stop that bill from becoming law, and or actually get it repealed. So those are some of the things that give you an indication of what might happen if that guy, current Lieutenant Governor Robinson, becomes the governor. We could expect steps backward in terms of public education. We could step backs in terms of protecting our environment. We could take steps backwards in terms of probably employment opportunities for everybody. So you could just go on and on and on about the negative consequences to us. And we're also likely, the progress that we've been trying to make in regards to justice reform, you could probably call a day on that as well.
All right, I think Mrs. Clark wants to ask a question, and Mrs. Clark, I want you to ask your question, and then before you answer, Senator Clark, allow me to chime in. In fact, let me just go ahead and do this now. Let me share with those of us who are on the line and those who will be listening what some of the statutory duties are of the office of Lieutenant Governor. And you can simply Google this and find precisely what I'm reading. Shall serve as president of the state Senate, shall maintain an office in Raleigh, open all business days, serve as gubernatorial successor. If anything should happen, God forbid, to the governor, then you would ascend to the role of the of the power of governor. It is empowered to declare an emergency if the governor is unavailable. Is a member of the State Board of Community Colleges, serves as vice chair to the North Carolina Central Capital Planning Commission, is a member of the State Board, is a member of the North Carolina Charter Schools Advisory Board, is also a member of the Domestic Violence Commission, is a member of the Military Affairs Commission, is chair of the Energy Policy Council, and so forth and so on. So I read all of that to simply let those of us know who are on this call, Senator Clark's reputation for being a leader, an innovator, handling adversity well, being resilient, all of that would apply in many diverse roles and responsibilities should he become our next lieutenant governor. I must say that we're not endorsing him, and anyone who wants to come on and talk about their campaign and how they would use their leadership role to apply to the needs of all North Carolinians, but particular relate to men of color, they're welcome to come on to this program in the same way that Senator Clark is here tonight. Having said all of that, as an African-American male, your African-American wife wants to ask you a question that all of us need to hear. So,
could I have a point of personal privilege first, if you don't mind,
yes.
Dr. McAllister and Dr. Dion?
Yes.
Okay, you mentioned that one of the roles of the lieutenant governor was to serve as the president of the Senate. I want to amplify on that a little bit for those who may not be familiar with the operations of the Senate itself. So the Senate conducts its legislative activities, the main activities within the Senate chambers. So if you were to walk into those chambers, you see a gentleman standing on the platform at the front of the chambers. And that is the position for the lieutenant governor when he's serving as president of the Senate. And I want you to think of that as serving as the MC, if you will. So his responsibilities as the MC are to make sure that any bills that are to be considered by the Senate for that day are introduced, and that the senators are allowed the opportunity to debate those bills, and that the bills are properly disposed of once the debate has taken place, or a bill is just to be referred back to a committee. Now, also, you'll notice that there are people sitting up in the galleries, and the lieutenant governor / MC is also responsible for making sure that order is maintained up in those galleries. So if people become somewhat unruly, he can ask them to please quiet down, and if they refuse, he can have them removed from the galleries by this sergeant at arms. And you might see sometimes down on a baseball diamond behind the umpire, behind the catcher, you have an umpire there calling balls and strikes. So if the senators are down on the floor debating and they're calling for points of privileges or want to have the opportunity to speak, the MC is the one that will engage with them and allow them to do that. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of amplification on what it means to serve as the president of the Senate. You have the floor, Dr. Dion.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Dr. McAllister. It's good to see you. Thank you, Senator. Good to see everyone tonight. Senator, I appreciated hearing your backstory. Obviously, I've heard it maybe 1 or 2 times before, but it was good to hear you talk about your family, your upbringing, your parents. I'd like to hear your heart for men of color, for Black men who have not been the beneficiaries of the type of upbringing that you had. In terms of, you talked about the military discipline, your parents' commitment to education, saving every penny for your education, your faith tradition, ethics, a sense of morality, perseverance. I'm really concerned, and I'm interested in hearing your heart for boys of color that become men of color that don't get that foundation, that sometimes are adrift, that need their leaders, their government to work for them. I'd really like to hear how you see the role of lieutenant governor and your own role as a leader in impacting the lives of people who haven't had the journey that you've had. I yield.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Dion. That's an issue that's front and center of my mind pretty much all the time. As you recall, one of the ways I was able to actually reach out and address this issue when I was a member of the state Senate was with our actions that we took on the Second Chance Act. I was very heartened to be able to participate in the debate and the activity associated with modifying our laws to give those young men a second chance and to have the ability to expunge their record for minor violations of the law in their youth. Because I understood how critical that was for some folks to be able to get their lives back on track. I mean, to be handicapped and handcuffed in terms of your ability to progress and make a living for yourselves because of something you did early in your youth, to me was just very, very troubling. And you also recall that I was very concerned when we had in this state, like many states, incidents taking place in which video was made available or was available, but not made available to the parents to view to see exactly what happened to their loved ones when they had conflicts with police. And that I was at the forefront of initiating action to get legislation ultimately through the General Assembly that now allows them to be able to have access to that video and within a certain time frame. So no longer can the police hide behind the notion that we're not going to release this because it might be prejudicial in some form or fashion, and that the only way that they could do that is they would actually have to seek court order approval and have that withholding approved by a judge. And also, that I've also been concerned about our judicial system in terms of the way we handle bail. This cash bail system, I think, needs to be significantly reformed. It's almost as though we're penalizing people for being poor. And as a state, we should not be doing that because, when our poor folks, and oftentimes the people of color, end up running into getting arrested by the law, they may not even be guilty, but they get arrested, they can't afford to pay the bill. Their parents can't afford to pay the bill. They can't scrape up the money. So what happens? They sit there in jail, even though they may be innocent. And that's just wrong. And I think many of the folks in this audience may be familiar with the story of Meek Mill about how he ended up being charged and convicted of a crime on trumped up charges that he did not do, and then ended up tied up in the probation system for almost a decade, many times having to go back to jail because of violations of probation resulting from specious claims of violations. And we have those issues in our state too. So not only do we need to break that school to prison pipeline, we need to reform our judicial system. We need to fight for justice and equality in this state. And that is something I will use my voice as a lieutenant governor to do. See, that is one thing that is not spoken of in the Constitution or the state statute that the lieutenant governor does have. The lieutenant governor has a platform, and it is a significant platform. And we've heard or seen that platform being used in a very divisive way over the last 2.5, 3 years or so by the current occupant. That platform should be used to bring people together, not to divide people. That platform should be used to uplift people, not to trod on them. I will never use that office to disparage, disdain, or disrespect a single person in this state, black, white, or otherwise. That position should not be used to try to pretend that a history that we know existed did not exist. That seat should never be held by a person that wants to claim that the Civil Rights era caused more harm than good to the African Americans of this state and of this country. We know that to be absolutely false. He says he was born and raised in Greensboro. I wasn't born and raised in Greensboro, but I went to North Carolina A&T State University when they had Scott Hall still up there, and you could see the marks and the bullet holes on the sides of the building that resulted from a protest actions back earlier in the earlier in the century. So I understand that everybody doesn't necessarily have as good a life as maybe I've had, but that doesn't mean that I am not acutely and intimately familiar with it. And I am certainly, if I'm elected to that office, going to use the office to continue to move forward and not one step back.
We're going to begin to wrap up here in just a few minutes. Our hour has passed. I want to apologize, by the way, for anyone who had difficulty getting on the call tonight. There were some technical difficulties. It took us a while to get them resolved. And so I want to thank the NCDP staff for doing what they always do, which is respond very quickly when there is a crisis. So I want to thank them for their contributions to this program, which is happening under the auspices of the department, or directorate, if you will, of community and coalitions. We didn't get a chance to talk too much about several other points. For example, sustaining excellence in education. You did talk about promoting justice and equality. We didn't talk about access to healthcare, even though I think you may have mentioned something about Medicaid expansion being included in the budget, which was just released today and will be voted on tomorrow. And of course, we could always talk about how to cultivate a more vibrant and inclusive economy. You can speak to any of those points if you wish, but I do want to open the floor one more time for anyone here who wishes to pose a question to Senator Clark. I don't see any hands yet, but if you wish to ask a question, the floor is yours. I'll wait roughly 3 to 5 seconds. Sam Brewer, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Senator Clark. What do you hear people talking about most when you traveling around the state and listening to voters?
Could you repeat that question? I did not quite understand what was asked.
I apologize. What issues do people bring up to you the most when you're talking to voters around the state?
Oh, for me, the main two things are education and healthcare. And I think I touched on the concept of Leandro earlier, but one thing that happened when I entered the General Assembly is clear that the Republican Party were going to take a different path with regard to the way they dealt with education, especially with the way they dealt with their teachers. Like at the time I first entered the General Assembly, teachers used to have what we call professional status, which was akin to tenureship. They stripped that away. And also teachers could receive additional compensation based on having a master's degree. They took that away. And also they were, at that point, the courts had already indicated that the General Assembly was not properly funding public education, and they refused to step up to the plate and increase the funding to appropriate levels. Now, I know a lot of times people hear folks saying out there, well, you can't just throw money at it, it's not going to solve it. Well, I tell you, if you don't pay people adequately, you're not going to be able to attract and retain the professional force cadre that you want in the Teachers Corps. And we know that any of you who work out in the private sector understand that if you want to get and retain high quality people, you're going to have to pay them well, or else you'll get them for a period of time and then they'll go work somewhere else. And that's what happens a lot of times, even amongst our teachers. And these are some bright people that are working with our students, and they can get employment, more lucrative employment that allows them to more appropriately and better raise their families and provide for their families. You know, a lot of them want to teach, they love that profession, but they still have to be able to earn the resources necessary to provide for their families. Now, and also that Leandro makes very specific requirements in terms of what providing a sound basic education is. And one of those things is to have competent teachers in every classroom. Another is to have competent administrators running the school. And so if you don't have those things in place, the schools will suffer, the kids will suffer, and we need to move along a path that mitigates or eliminates a lot of those problem areas. And another point of contention for me personally relates to the results, the outcomes. I believe we ought to focus on reading like nothing else. I mean, if our kids are leaving the third grade and only 30 or 40%, actually around closer to 30% of them are able to read at grade level, we have a problem. And it's been like that for far too long, because we know that reading sets the foundation for being successful, not only for the rest of your K-12 matriculation, but to if you want to pursue coursework at the community college or at a postgraduate institution of higher learning, it will be problematic in that regard too, especially in our higher tech society nowadays. So really, we have to make sure that our kids are being able to read competently for them to be able to learn the material that they will be exposed to once they leave the third grade and beyond.
Senator Clark, I want to thank you tonight for, first of all, not only coming on the show, on Chop It Up, I call it the show, our program. I really want to thank you for being an excellent role model. And I know that it takes a lot of grit, a lot of determination to do the type of campaigning that you're doing. You've run successfully. You've had the not so enjoyable experience of not being successful as a candidate, but that has not stopped you. It has not prevented you from serving in any way that you can. And wherever you have served, it is obvious to those who are listening tonight that your intentions are not just shelved when you get to where you're going, but you actually make an impact where you're going. And so I think that serves as an excellent role model for not only African-American men or men of color, but I think it serves as an excellent role model for those who are looking at people like you and Justice Morgan and many others across the state as they try to decide what type of person who they want to be, and often we don't always mention often enough on this particular program how important it is to uplift appropriate role models of service and of senior level experience, and you bring all of that to the table as a former senator and as a former officer in the U.S. Air Force. Patriotism, if you could give us a final word on what it means to you to be a citizen, a former officer, and someone who loves this country and loves this state and wants to see the best for this state. We'll wrap up on this particular question tonight, but please take a couple of minutes and respond to that, please.
Yeah, that's a good question to have the opportunity to respond to, because oftentimes you hear that word used in what I consider to be a very flippant manner. You know, people wave the flag and shout USA, USA. But when I wave the flag and serve for this country, it's about serving for everyone. You don't wave the flag and use it to divide people or to try to claim that you're better than another group. You should be raising the flag to symbolize unity, not divisiveness, unity. And that means taking into consideration the opinions of everyone. That means trying to establish policy that serves for the greater good, not just for one party or one segment of a party or one segment of the electorate. And so I always take that to heart. So when we look at an individual in the eye, we need for that individual to understand, as patriots, we serve them. I serve you. And I would just like to add one little additional note that might be somewhat off the topic of patriotism. But since you say this session here is really to speak a lot to a large degree to the African-American men, I can remember it was my first biennium when I was in state senate. I happened to be speaking to a group of kids. And of course, it was one of the typical sessions we'd have where we try to encourage them to, pay attention to their teachers, work hard, study, and they'd have the opportunity to be successful in life. And I can remember as they were leaving the classroom, one of the escorts, a gentleman, he was an African-American male, I'd say he was probably about 45 years old. And he looked at me. And he said, "What about me?" What about me? And I just want you to know, I've never forgotten that man, and I won't forget you. Thank you.
Thank you. I was muted there for just a moment. That's moving, very touching, and I hope that those of you who are on the call tonight understand that Senator Clark is obviously someone who we are very proud of. So let's just give him a round of applause, those of us who can come off mute and sort of clap, if you would. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, this has been great. I've enjoyed this, I've learned a lot from it. You, Senator Clark, and you know, every now and then people want to talk about others of us who are on this call being involved in political campaigns. I know Dr. Click has actually campaigned for office, and I'm sure he is inspired by many of the things that he has heard tonight. I want to thank my dear brother Kerry Pay of the Faith and Values group that he founded for being on the call and bringing insights to this conversation. He didn't speak, but we're always having conversation. And obviously, Mrs. Clark, Dr. Dion Clark, for your influence upon the candidate. In the future, we will have more of these conversations. And in the future, we may also be conducting debate forums to talk about not just the general issues of the campaign, but in particular, the voices and the needs and the plight of African American and Hispanic and other minority men in this state. So we invite you to come back. Our next forum will be held on October 4th. That will be the date of our next conversation. We're going to switch it up a bit. On the 4th, we're going to have Judge Cubbage coming to speak. She understands that this is a men of forum conversation, but we want to include the women because sometimes the women have a significant impact, especially if they're sitting in judicial seats upon the lives of men of color. So we're going to have her come on October 4th. We invite all of you to come back, invite your family and friends and neighbors and everyone. And in the future, Senator Clark, I pledge to have you back because we want to get updates on how the campaign is going and perhaps even have you and your principal primary challenger have a conversation about some of these pressing issues. In the meantime, thank you once again. And it is 8:13. We've been here roughly 1 hour and 13 minutes. So I think we're on schedule to wrap up for tonight. Does anyone have a question that they want to ask before we shut everything down for tonight? I presume not. Thank you very much. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Peace.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.